Welcome to the Startup Show. I'm your host, John Biggs. In every episode of the Startup Show, we talk to an amazing entrepreneur about how they do what they do. We'll explore tactics, tricks, and techniques for building some of the coolest things on the planet. Thanks for listening and enjoy. Welcome back to the Startup Show. I'm John Biggs. Today on the show, I have Max Buchan from Valarian. Welcome, Max.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. It's a great day here in London.
Yeah, it's an acceptable day here in New York since it's getting so hot. But I guess you guys have whatever.
Yeah.
You had a heat wave there when it was like 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So
yeah, deeply empathize.
All right. So why don't you tell us about what you're working on?
Yeah, for sure. So I started this business, Valarian, mid-2020. I had come out of a rapid growth fintech journey at a business called CoinShares. I was on the very early team then. We hadn't raised any venture, but the team grew from kind of two or three to like about 200 people and went public on the NASDAQ, all that good stuff. We had a lot of regulatory visibility. I mean, we were operating between many different jurisdictional climates. And I started Valarian to solve a lot of the kind of jurisdictional issues about where data was, how it was stored, how it was secured, all that good stuff. So Valarian's original raison d'etre was to solve that for the enterprise space. So how do you control where data is, how it moves, especially when it comes to third-party applications? You mentioned communication systems, which is obviously where we began. It then became a lot more than that. And then my co-founder, Josh, spent 18 years serving in the US Special Forces, mainly the Army Rangers and a couple of other SMUs, and then spent 12 years at Palantir Technologies. So he came at it from a very different space. And then we've ended up under the group with essentially two facets. We have Valarian Enterprise, which serves, banks, pharma companies, airlines, and then Valarian Defense, which works for, it works on national security for NATO member states.
And there's no B2C component there, or there's no consumer component, or is it just enterprise and military?
No, not at all. We think of ourselves as digital infrastructure. So we sit underneath, applications that need to be used for a whole host of reasons. That could be comm systems. It could be safely transferring LLMs, running them on compartmentalized systems, on hardware. We also have deployable systems into the battlefields, which are, take our platform, Accra. Our infrastructure platform is called Accra. Literally run it on GPUs that sit in a Pelican case, and then you can use that to spin up a segregated network in really difficult climates. So, there's a bunch of stuff we're doing across the board. We obviously just raised a bit more funding at the beginning of this year by some American defense investors, but we've largely been deploying that in Europe so far.
So in terms of getting a segregated network up and running, what does that look like? Is that a local network between the devices that are out in the field? Do you have connectivity to the internet?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously I can't really get into how or why or where this is used. So sorry for being super macro about this, but yeah, there's a couple of ways that you can run that. You can either have, essentially how our hardware product works is as I said, it's stringing a cluster together in a GPU that's portable. It's about the size of an American football. And you put a couple of these in the battlefield, and either you connect that to something like Starlink, or you can even run it on kind of local networks if you need to. So there's a few different ways of running it, depending on how extreme the territory is that it needs to be running. And we have a couple of quite interesting use cases that obviously, sorry to not be able to go into, but it's been fascinating from my perspective to see that proliferate.
I mean, it seems like I don't think a lot of people are thinking about that. I mean, the idea of digital connectivity on a battlefield is going to be far more important than even radio connectivity at this point, especially encrypted and secure is probably going to be pretty vital as well.
Yeah, and I also think visibility, right, is a key thing. It's like making sure one isn't able to discern what groups are present. So that's a really key thing. So you don't want data exfiltrating and making visible who or what a person is doing, right? So it's that's a key facet of this. Is kind of what appears in the network writ large.
So you've been around for about 5 years, I suppose, at this point. Mm-hmm. And how has the journey been?
It's been interesting. I mean, if I'm totally honest, it was probably 2 orders of magnitude more difficult to build than we anticipated. So, when I came out of CoinShares and saw the problem, the kind of what I saw as the data sovereignty issue, because I guess I looked at it from a bit of a macro political lens in the sense of being British. I just lived through Brexit, so from a physical sovereignty perspective, we had Brexit, obviously the fight for Ukraine, Hong Kong seized 20 years earlier than anyone had anticipated. And then frankly, you've got the impending uncertainty over Taiwan. So I had this thesis that, digital sovereignty would be the next frontier after physical sovereignty becoming such a, so present. Yeah, so I, set out in 2020 to build a digital sovereignty infrastructure company. As I said, the complexity and sophistication of technology that we had to build was much more difficult than I had anticipated, quite frankly. So it took us probably 3 years to get it robust enough that we really started to test use cases. And then last year we were really getting into production. And that's one of the things that necessitated us to spin up a defense arm, because one of our first meaningful use cases was with part of the US government. And so that was quite interesting starting to test those.
How do you define sovereignty in this case? I mean, there are a few ways, especially in the crypto world, the idea of sovereignty would even suggest almost like a digital nation, but you're thinking more of a complete control of that particular piece of information.
Exactly, yeah. So I mean, how our platform works, it's almost looks like the replicated back end of the system. And one of the reasons we started focusing on communications was our Acra platform essentially replicates transparent encrypted database and object store, ingress, even kind of certificate pinning, certificate management, everything that you would kind of see if you were trying to build the back end of a system. And then we make that deployable so you can spin up a version of this in 3, 4, 5 minutes. And then on top of that replicated back end, you start to run applications. Now, the reason I kind of go through that is this isn't like some HSM. It's not, it's not some kind of management system. What it is you are completely changing the traffic flow of where you're sending data. So the customer, and that can be a government, it can be a bank, it can be whatever you want it to be, they own not just the keys, but they own the actual database itself. And so from a sovereignty perspective, it's how do you control the entire system, both where the data is generated and where it's kept and how it's managed. So it's the kind of entire stack when we think of sovereignty is as the CEO of Valarian, even if I wanted to, I don't have any access to any of our systems because it's generative on deployments. Every deployment of Acra, Valarian's key product, is unique. So every single time, it's generative on deployment. So it generates its unique backend.
So it's almost like a secure Docker instance with all the backend, all the data associated with the backend. And everything you need to run your product anywhere, right? Interesting. All right, very cool.
Exactly. Like a super secure Kubernetes cluster, kind of running a container in a container. But so I think that's a great way of thinking about it.
All right, interesting. What's next for the company?
So we just announced a round co-led by a defense fund in Austin, Texas called Scout Ventures. They had also come out of the Rangers, like my co-founder had, a fantastic group. And then Artis, who was an early Palantir investor. They're mainly a biotech fund, but they've done, they did seed round of Second Front, and we're huge fans of Second Front. There's a lot of friends over there. And then the third investor was an angel investor called Gokul, who you might know on the West Coast, who's been incredibly helpful to us, especially in terms of the hiring journey. So obviously a big thing for us has been hiring and technical capacity, because this has become, with the geopolitical shifts that are happening in the world, especially, being here in the UK, it is really changing. And the drive towards sovereignty and digital sovereignty, we have struggled to keep up with delivery in terms of just getting this out the door fast enough. So really, we're just scaling the engineering bandwidth, and frankly, are probably going to look to acquire some more capabilities and maybe some smaller firms.
And how has it been selling into government?
Well, for me, it's a very new experience. I never served. I come from a small town in England called Canterbury. This is not at all my world. I'm very lucky that my business partner, not only spent 18 years in, special operations in the US, but at Palantir had spent a long time selling into government. For us, excuse me for my cough, I think the way I would explain it when I've been asked before, essentially how we got through this very quickly, I often say it's kind of the same with the enterprise. If the need is strong enough and the desire to implement is strong enough, procurement tends to go fairly quickly. And that can be the same at a bank. Sometimes it takes 18 to 24 months. Sometimes a bank deal takes 6 months, right? If the need is strong enough and the will to proceed is there. So we found, especially on the governmental use cases, what we're doing has been hyper relevant for some really specific use cases. And for that kind of stuff, it's been much easier to kind of construct, the right kind of vehicles to get things moving. Because I think if there is the demand and the technical capacity on the other side, things can move quite quickly.
And what needs to be done? What do you think is missing in the European defense ecosystem? What should people be looking into?
That is a really, really good question, John, and I think about this quite a lot. The US has built such a robust ecosystem. And I don't want to harp on about this, but the US is quite incredible. Obviously, Palantir was one of the early ones, but you look at companies like Anduril, right? If you look at the breadth of capability, it's really incredible. I do think that will change in Europe. I think we are making progress, but we are obviously behind, in terms of technical capability. The issue, I think, sometimes is we conflate increase budget spending with increased capability. Because the reality is we could go to 5% of GDP, we could go to 10% of GDP. Just because we start to throw money at the equation, it's not necessarily going to translate into procuring the right set of capabilities. And that's kind of the what I see a lot, because the reality is you might just end up with more bloated primes around Europe. I think if we're actually going to foster innovation at the rate we want to, I think it's going to end up being a consortium of very highly able, innovative companies. And also, I think the last thing I would say is the cultural change that I think is having to happen in the UK and Europe at large. The US is much more forward-leaning in terms of adoption and in terms of access to innovation. We are much more risk averse as a culture, especially in the UK. So we are seeing that change, and I think we are also leaning into that more. To buy, like for instance, here in the UK, wanting to buy British software. Problem is, historically, there hasn't really been anything that kind of can compete. So obviously at Valarian, we are hoping to change that. We are trying to be competitive in those tenders with the best companies in the world.
Okay. Very cool. All right, super. So folks should, if they need a battlefield-ready Kubernetes inside a Docker instance systems, they should go to Valarian.com. Is that right?
Yeah, that's very kind, John. And so, yeah, I mean, look, that's the very extreme example of the capability, right? I mean, our platform Acra is, again, we're selling into banks and airlines and stuff on the enterprise side. And then you've got some, frankly, slightly more vanilla governance type integrations. And then you have the slightly more extreme end, which is, we want to run this in a Pelican case. We want to drop it on the ground, and we want to be able to throw a thermite grenade at it, and so that it disappears. So that kind of stuff is slightly on the more extreme end. So it's not necessarily.
Yeah. Well, there might be some enterprise instances of that as well. You can't rule that out.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And our chairman, Nick, who I appointed last year, co-founded a business called Darktrace in the UK, which was one of the highest growth companies here. And we think a lot about the repeatability and scalability of everything that we do, because you're absolutely right. You don't want to have like a super bespoke thing that's not relevant elsewhere. So, for instance, the secure transfer of LLMs piece on top of Acra, that came out of a government research project, but we are now selling into the enterprise. So we like to do things that are applicable to both sides of the fence. That's what being a dual purpose company, I think, is all about.
All right. So Max, thank you for joining us. It's been fascinating.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
All right. This has been The Startup Show. We will see you next episode.